Back.
Thank you, Acting Deputy President. It's a bit rich to be lectured at by a senator from the Labor Party who inherited not only a surplus in 2007 but about $40 billion in the bank and passed over a debt of $200 billion, which, as those of us who are paying it back know, that we are borrowing, Acting Deputy President, borrowing offshore $400 million a day. $1.2 billion a month we borrow to repay Labor's debt. Don't talk to me about debt. I do agree with Senator Hanson, as everyone else does, that it is only fair that multinational companies pay their tax. But it's interesting, Acting Deputy President, that about $2 billion a year that the Tax Commissioner thinks multinationals aren't paying is about 6 weeks' interest on Labor's debt from 2007 to 2013. The other day, in fact, the Taxation Commissioner really advised us where the real figures lie in a speech he made on the 16th of March, only last Thursday. And he said, yes, it's probably the case that multinationals are avoiding about $2 billion a year in tax, and I'll tell you how this government is working to make sure they pay the lot. But what the Taxation Commissioner said was, it is average Australians who are actually costing the budget about $19.7 billion in claims we should not be making as a result of work-related expenses. He said that is by far and away the largest component, and the second, of course, to use his words, the willingness on the part of ordinary Australians to ignore the tax evasion implicit in paying tax, in his words, for a kitchen renovation or a cheap meal. So $24 or $25 billion each year is lost to the Australian economy as a result of ourselves and people willing to participate in the cash market, and his projection is about $2 billion a year. In fact, if I can quote again from Tax Commissioner Jordan, getting every single dollar out of multinationals and large corporates is not going to make a dent, Mr Jordan said. The biggest of all is individuals, he said, wage and salary earners claiming work-related expenses. That's what we've got to actually focus on in this country. But again, it's interesting that Senator Singh would come into this place and criticise the coalition government because when in 2015 the Turnbull government introduced the multinational anti-avoidance legislation, which I'll refer to as MAL, a piece of legislation that would in fact be expected to claw back about $2 billion under its crackdown on multinational tax avoidance this year. Where was the Australian Labor Party, Mr Acting Deputy President? It's a shame Senator Singh isn't here to answer the question, because the Labor opposition opposed it, and it required us to get the support of the Greens political party so that that legislation could be passed, because Labor was very, very happy to allow the multinationals to continue to avoid paying that tax. And it's interesting, they've got some chance of redeeming themselves through you, Acting Deputy President, to Senator Dastyari this time round, because in this year, 2017, the Turnbull government has introduced the Combating Multinational Tax Avoidance Bill of 2017, and it gives the Labor opposition the opportunity to realise their sinful ways, in fact this time round to support that legislation. Nowhere near as effective as the MAL legislation, because that will this year claw back about $2 billion, but at least the other new Combating Multinational Tax Avoidance will in fact yield some hundreds of millions of dollars. But let me just, if I may, in the time available to me, make a few points about who pays tax in this country. Who are the two biggest taxpayers in this country? Are they the banks? No, they're not. Are they the insurance companies? No, they are not. As Senator Smith knows only too well, from our home state of Western Australia, the two biggest taxpayers in this nation by a country mile are BHP Billiton, which is paying somewhere around about, I think 2 years ago, so probably more now, some $4.9 billion US dollars, so probably closer to $6 billion, which they paid in 2014. And when royalties and resource rent tax are taken into account, BHP Billiton paid more than $8.7 billion, more than 10 billion Australian dollars, at a rate, if you don't mind, of some 45%. As the Minister for Resources would know, the contribution by the big resources company is massive, $8.7 billion US dollars. I'll go to Rio Tinto. 2015, Rio Tinto in US dollars paid in Australia $1.5 billion US dollars in tax and $1.4 billion in government royalties to either federal or state government entities. Rio Tinto and BHP pay their fair share. But once again, it's important, from the comments that have been made by senators in this place, to understand how misinformation Acting Deputy President can get out. And regrettably, it was the then member for the Pilbara, Mr Brendan Grills, who jumped on a figure of 50 cents a tonne for iron ore in Western Australia and invited the entire Western Australian community to believe that the only figure paid per tonne of iron ore by the two majors, BHP and Rio, was 50 cents a tonne. Well, here are the facts. And in fact, enough people in the Pilbara must have believed them, because Mr Grills is no longer the member for the Pilbara. Those two companies pay about $18 per tonne for iron ore, Acting Deputy President, not 50 cents a tonne. They pay $18 a tonne, of which $14 is tax. Around about $4.50 per tonne is paid as a royalty, depending on price. And lo and behold, at the bottom of it all, there's a figure of 50 cents. 50 cents. So what did Mr Grills do? He grabbed hold of the 50 cents, he forgot the $17.50 conveniently, and ran a line that the only figure that BHP and Rio Tinto pay is 50 cents a tonne. Well, the community of Western Australia has spoken, and they have a very good idea on Mr Grills' contribution. It was his own electorate that voted him out the other day. I go, if I may, to another of the multinationals that seems to be the subject of a lot of scrutiny, and that is Chevron and its partners on Gorgon and Wheatstone on the North West Shelf. Gorgon based on Barrow Island and Wheatstone in the town of Onslow. And here are some figures, Acting Deputy President, just to alert you to the value of multinational investment in this country. In the construction phases of Wheatstone and Gorgon, some 60 billion, not million, 60,000 million dollars has been paid of local content to the Australian economy in the construction phase of those two projects to date. $60 billion. Over the 30-year life of Gorgon and Wheatstone, it is predicted that there will be a contribution to Australia's GDP of over $1 trillion, more than 150,000 full-time equivalent jobs, $340 billion to federal government revenue, and already in the town of Onslow, which Senator Smith and I know is just a small regional town, some $250 million already of social infrastructure has gone into Onslow. So this is the level of investment. Is there anything else in Australia? $100 billion has been invested by Gorgon and their partners in those two projects. Let me put $100 billion US dollars into perspective. That's 130 billion Australian dollars. If the Snowy Mountain scheme was built today, it would be a $9 billion Australian dollar project today. Contrast that with 130 billion Australian dollars of just two projects alone, as Australia goes to being the biggest LNG exporter. And you will hear commentary on petroleum resource rent tax. Remember, that is a super profits tax on top of the normal taxes paid by multinationals. You should know that better than anybody.
Senator Beck.